Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for another edition of the Money Pros. I'm Oliver Tutt, certified financial planner practitioner, and I'll be your host for the next half hour as we talk about all the issues related to your money, how to make it, how to keep it, and hopefully how to help it grow. Let me tell you what we have in store for today's show. First up, we'll be talking about the question of whether or not divorce is jeopardizing retirement savings. It's becoming more and more common that people that are nearing retirement age are getting divorced, and we want to talk about what impacts that could potentially have on the state of retirement savings in America. And then we're going to switch gears and talk to a very special guest. She is Kathy Catanzaro, and she is with the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training. Now, a month or two ago, we did a show regarding the RIDLT's program we call Workshare. And we had a guest on here that was the president of a company that utilized the Workshare program. And so Kathy is going to be here to tell us about the nuts and bolts of the program and dig in to more about exactly what Workshare does for the employers and the employees of the state of Rhode Island. So we're going to be talking about that. Then we're going to be talking about the question of whether cash in the bank makes you happy or not. Now, the answer to that question may seem obvious, but there's actually more to it than that. And there's some interesting research that's come out from across the pond in the UK that I thought would be interesting to share with the audience. And then finally, we're going to be tackling a question we got from a viewer on the upcoming presidential election and what it might mean for their retirement savings. So stay tuned for that at the end of the show. So let's jump right in. And first off, we're going to be talking about somewhat troubling new trend, and it's actually something I've seen in my own practice, unfortunately, and that is the idea that as couples are nearing retirement age, divorce is becoming more and more common. Interestingly, statistically in the United States, divorce as a whole across the population is becoming less common. People are staying married, and divorces are occurring less frequently. However, that is not the case in the age 50 and over category. And what's particularly relevant with respect to that category for me is that's where the bulk of my clients are in terms of age, and that's where people really start to focus in on retirement savings, which is obviously one of the primary financial planning concerns that my clients have. And this is actually something I've seen in my own practice. So when I saw some new data recently in the news, I thought it would be a good thing to share with everyone here on the show. So here's the deal. Americans over 50 are actually getting divorced at a higher rate than those people younger. So from 50 and younger, divorce is less frequent, but 50 and over, it's becoming more frequent. According to the National Center for Family and Marriage Research at Bowling Green State University, people 50 and over comprised 25% of those who got divorced in 2014. That's up 8% from the same category in 1990. So not only are they getting divorced more frequently, but they're getting divorced more frequently than in younger age groups. Now, there's potentially a lot of reasons for that, and some of the research that I saw speculated on a number of reasons why that might be. That's not really what I want to talk about here on the show today. What I really want to focus in on are what impacts getting divorced at that age may have on retirement savings programs, because there's obviously some pretty critical issues to consider. So let's throw up a slide and we'll walk through these things one at a time. The first thing to consider is the added expenses. The research shows that the majority of older people who get divorced see a decline in their standard of living, and the reality is there's simply just added expenses with respect to two households versus one household, whether it's rents, mortgages, food, utilities, all the basic expenses, but then all the things you probably want to do, whether it be recreation and entertainment or a whole host of other things. It's not so much about taking care of the kids. Kids aren't usually the issue in this particular age range, but definitely what we're seeing is added expenses, and then that means there's a challenge with respect to saving for retirement, because obviously everyone is more concerned with meeting their day-to-day standard of living expenses than putting money away from retirement, and they don't do that until they have excess income. So the next thing that has a significant impact potentially is alimony, and I will tell you that this isn't always the sort of cliche, the husband paying the wife. This can work in both directions. It depends on what spouse makes more money. But alimony can be a significant financial factor. And in that age range from 50 to 65, that's where incomes are typically the highest. So alimony can be a significant job or expense, significantly taking away from both people's ability to fund retirement savings. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about is retirement plans. So there's a couple of things here. One, your 401k and things like that, they're going to have to get split up in a divorce, and they're going to have to be divided equally, and there's a whole court process that one would go through to affect that. But also it affects your retirement planning, because all the planning you've likely done up to this point is based on the assumption that it's going to be one household living together. Once those households get split into two, not only do the expenses go up like we've talked about, but the resources that were available to fund that retirement get split in half. And so that has a significant impact on your retirement planning. So this is a troubling new trend. I've seen, unfortunately, a couple of my clients in this age range divorced after long periods of time being married, and it's something definitely worthy of keeping an eye on. All right, next up, we're going to switch gears entirely. We're going to talk to Kathy Catanzaro from the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training about the Workshare program. So stay with us. We will be right back. Welcome back to the Money Pros. I'm joined by a special guest, Kathy Catanzaro. She is, now you must have a two-page business card, because your title, as I have it, is Chief of Unemployment Insurance Special Programs for the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training. That took 2 lines on my sheet, so that's a pretty big mouthful.
It's a pretty big bio, yes. I oversee all of the special programs for unemployment insurance. Workshare happens to be one of my most important programs. They're all important, but Workshare is something that over the course of the Great Recession we took great pride in. So
we're going to be talking about exactly how the program worked during the Great Recession. I think that's going to be a fascinating story. Now, to refresh viewers' minds, or for those people that hadn't seen the prior segment that I referenced in the opening, we had Joanne Bagley from, she's the CEO of Kenyon Industries.
yes.
She's really one of the, I hope she doesn't take offense to the term, poster child for her company for the success of the program and how valuable it can be to Rhode Island employers and
That
their
is
employees.
absolutely true.
So we talked about her experience, but we're having you back because, and I would point out that although the Workshare program is not sort of quintessentially personal financial planning, I don't think there can be anything more important to Rhode Islanders' personal finances than the job they have and how secure it is, which is why we think this is so important
That's
to
right.
talk to you about. But wanted to have you back to really talk about the nuts and bolts of the program. How does it work? Who does it benefit? What are the qualifications? So we'll certainly get into that. But one of the things that I found really interesting is that our own Rhode Island Senator, Jack Reed, has been a huge supporter of the program, not only here in the state, but nationwide. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how he's been able to be an advocate for the program and help it expand.
Sure. Senator Reed has always looked to representatives in Rhode Island to get information on the Workshare program. He has highlighted the program even pre-recession, having some news stories, going out to employers that participated in the program, highlighting their experience and getting that out in the news. But when the Great Recession hit, he already had that knowledge of how important this program was. He actually authored the Layoff Prevention Act of 2012, which was part of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Jobs Creation Act. So he authored this very important legislation, which encouraged other states that didn't have, at the federal level, it's called short-time compensation. And this legislation encouraged other states to create programs in their own, and that was based on the knowledge that Rhode Island's program saves jobs, helps employers, helps employees.
So even if you are not an employer that needs this program or an employee that benefits from it, I think it's safe to say that all Rhode Islanders can be pretty proud that in many respects, Rhode Island is pioneering this type of alternative to unemployment insurance.
We definitely are one of the showcase states for the short-time compensation program. We call it Workshare here in Rhode Island, but we've had the program in place so that employers could utilize it during economic downturns or just between contracts when there's not enough work available. It's been here since 1992, available for employers to use.
So before we jump into the nuts and bolts, I think we have a video that Senator Reid did just recently, and we have a clip of that
We do.
starting to talk about exactly what the program is. So without further ado, let's see if we can roll that footage.
Since 2008, work sharing has saved as many as 14,000 Rhode Island jobs and 570,000 jobs in participating states across the country. Work sharing is a simple concept. When the economy slows down and a business feels pressure to lay off workers, the business can choose instead to decrease work hours across the board. The worker's reduced paycheck is then supplemented with a proportional unemployment insurance payment for their reduced time on the job.
So that's Jack Reed himself talking about exactly what the program does, and that video goes on a bit longer, but it's a great intro. It's essentially an alternative to the traditional unemployment that many Rhode Islanders are probably familiar with. And unemployment, while it's a great safety net, it's not a great alternative. I mean, I think most people would much prefer to keep their jobs, and that's what this program allows people to do. Am I right?
Exactly right. What Workshare allows is for an employer who is potentially facing layoffs to take this alternative approach, and it allows the employer to reduce the normal work hours of a select group of employees or all employees. There must be at least 2 to participate, and the employer can reduce the hours of work by 10 to 50%. So that means that the employer is maintaining their skilled workforce. They are avoiding the loss of those employees to potentially other employment opportunities while they're on layoff. And it also helps the employee feel like they've been protected.
It also means more money, in all likelihood, in the employee's pocket. Because they're going to, between their reduced salary and the made-up unemployment benefits, will have more money than if they were strictly on unemployment. And one of the things that Joanne pointed out, they keep their benefits as well.
They do.
And that's a huge thing for the employees.
It's one of the requirements of the program, and so they are. The whole point of it is it's a win-win. The employer wins because they're reducing their labor costs while they're participating in the program. Employers make an investment in training and getting their employees to be at that skill level that they need them to be. So when there's a layoff, there is the potential of losing that investment. And employees feel that the morale in the workplace remains high. They know that the employer is taking steps to protect those jobs and to protect their employment. There's an emotional aspect.
So, given how important the program is, I want to make sure we have some time to talk about the nuts and the bolts. So the first thing, and you alluded to one of these already, what are the requirements for the employer to participate in the Workshare program? What are the minimum thresholds that they have to meet?
Sure. So there needs to be a minimum of 2 employees that participate in the program. The employer must be current on unemployment insurance taxes, or they must be on a payment agreement with the tax unit. The employer has to present a plan to us, and we help you with that plan. We have a template that we use in the application process. There needs to be it needs to avert a certain percentage of layoffs. So the employer has to really look at the business process at that point, the amount of work that they have available for the employees, and come up with a plan, present it to us in the application process. They must notify the employees ahead of time, whenever feasible, that they are planning to utilize the Workshare program, And if there is a collective bargaining unit within the company,
Like a union, essentially.
yes, the collective bargaining unit representatives need to sign off on the plan as well.
So tell me about the application process. Is it a bureaucratic nightmare, or is it easier than that?
Well, let me say this. It is definitely, at this point, a paper-driven program.
Okay.
So the employer fills out several documents in order to apply for the program. And in addition to that, employees must fill out a paper unemployment insurance application. They fax in or mail in those documents to the department. We look at the entire plan, make an approval or denial in very few cases. And then we also send out biweekly payment forms that the employer must complete.
Now you have, I don't want to interrupt you, but we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to talk about some changes that are coming to
Yes.
streamline that a bit, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Our department is working in consortium with the states of Mississippi and Maine to build a new web-based unemployment insurance claim system. We have included the Workshare program in that process so that we will be automating the entire process. Employers will be able to apply online, report weekly hours of work online, and payments will be automated as well. So it won't be that paper-driven, labor-intensive program that it is now. We expect in a year or so to implement the new program, and I think employers are going to love the fact that it's not going to be paper, it's not going to be pen.
So we're out of time, unfortunately, but I want to stress for those people that are watching, that are employers that may need to utilize it, that they shouldn't let the paper discourage them, because it's not an impossible process, and it's a process that's going to become easier.
No, and in fact, studies have been done that even with the paper-driven current process, employers love this program. We had so many employers say without it, their doors would have closed during the recession.
And Kenyon Industries was an excellent example of that.
Absolutely.
All right, Kathy, I'm going to have to hold you there, but thanks so much for joining us. It's a great program, and I'm happy that Rhode Island is pioneering it. All right, stay tuned. Up next, does cash in the bank make you happier? You might be surprised at some of the answers. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Money Pros. So we want to talk about the question of whether having cash in the bank actually makes you happier or not. And I'll skip to the end, and it definitely does. And we have some research to support that. But here's why it's important to talk about. As a financial planner, I often work with clients to talk to them about how much cash they should have in an emergency fund or set aside. And some people are very resistant to the idea of having any money not in their investments, quote unquote, working for them. Meanwhile, other people like to have a significant amount of cash on the sidelines. And sometimes I find myself in the position of having to talk them out of that, amount of cash may be too much of a security blanket. But what's interesting is that the amount of cash, it turns out, that people have in the bank can have a lot to do with actually how happy they are. So there was some research commissioned by some banks across the pond, as they say, in the United Kingdom. There was researchers at the University of Cambridge for a UK bank that was not named in the study that indicated that the amount of cash in the bank had a significant impact on the level of the happiness of the people they studied. So let me put up a slide and we'll talk about the issues. The first thing is the question of, are you happier with cash in the bank versus investments in other assets? In other words, what makes you happy? Your overall aggregate wealth, or you're just a wealthy person, or is it specifically the cash in the bank? And as it turns out, it has more to do with the cash in the bank than the overall aggregate wealth. The study indicated that having more cash in your bank account is a better predictor of happiness, and they go through the methodology that they use to study happiness, than how much somebody's aggregate wealth is. So having just simply cash in the bank can have a lot to do with that. And also, interestingly, that was true for not only middle class and less well-off people, but also true for the wealthiest citizens that were studied. So cash had an impact. Next thing up, cash versus stuff. What are you happier with, cash or things? And in most cases, the research indicated that the cash in the bank actually made people happier. However, a separate study done for some credit unions over there indicated that as they looked at clients' bank balances and matched that to their debit card transactions, people were happy with things as long as the things met their lifestyle and personality. So it was a very complex relationship between would people rather have money or would they rather have the stuff that money can buy, and how good are you at choosing between those two things. And then finally, the last thing on the slide here, how much is actually enough? In other words, if $1,000 makes you happy, will $1 million make you happier? Well, surprisingly enough, it turns out that there was sort of a law of diminishing returns. In other words, going from $1 to $1,000 in somebody's bank account saw a significant increase in their overall sort of state of well-being or happiness versus somebody that went from $1,000 to $10,000. So there was definitely some diminishing returns. But it's a good lesson for me and a good lesson for other people that it's not just about what makes sense on paper to have in the bank, but sometimes it has a lot to do with what's really going to make you feel satisfied. So cash in the bank can be a good feeling sometimes. All right, up next, we're going to answer a question on the presidential election and retirement savings. Stay with us. There's more to come here on The Money Pros. Welcome back to The Money Pros. Time for our viewer question, so let me throw it up on the screen and tell you what it is. Viewer writes to me and says, I'm concerned about the upcoming presidential election and what's going to happen to my 401k. I only have about 5 years until I retire and I can't afford to lose a lot of money. I think about pulling my money out of the market and waiting until after the election. What do you think? Well, I'll tell you what, you don't say in your message whether you're a Trump supporter or a Clinton supporter or one of the alternative candidates. And you know what? It doesn't matter, because based on the people that I talk to, if you support Clinton, you think the world's going to end if Trump gets elected. If you support Trump, you think the world's going to end if Clinton gets elected. But the bottom line is, we've talked about on this show that presidential elections can have a distinct impact on the stock market. So I can't discount the possibility that before or immediately after the election, there can be a downturn. But there's no guarantee of that. And the problem is, if you take your money out, you're going to be faced with a very difficult decision, and that's putting your money back in. So you really have to ask yourself, is the presidential election really going to have an irreversible impact on your portfolio, or is this just one of the many milestones that we're going to see in our history, that we've seen in our history and that we're going to see in our future? My advice, stick with it as long as your portfolio is right for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time on The Money Pros.